Well, that's very interesting. Okay, let's we're going to go into our church history here. And I've been trying to give you a little highlight of the drama of church history of that day. There's so many little interesting tidbits of history. So this is my church history highlight. This evening, I want to focus just a minute on Pope Boniface. That should be the 8th, and then the 7 sacraments. So the question here is, what happens when a power-mad dictator meets a power-mad pope? What happens when two people crazy for power butt heads? That's what happened with Pope Boniface VIII and King Phillip, who was the king of France at this time. And we remember we talked about that other conflict between King Henry and the Pope Gregory, I believe, and the conflict they had, and then the king had to make that walk to Canossa, and he had to humble himself before his enemy. So there were all these conflicts between popes and kings. So this is kind of like the culmination of it. It's spoken of, if you look in our book on page 210, he does reference this, because basically the Pope badly loses this conflict with King Philip. And so Philip was excommunicated by Boniface. And then Philip sent to kidnap the Pope. He went to kidnap the Pope. So this doesn't happen very often in history, where the Pope got kidnapped for 3 days. And when the Pope was met by the military people who came to kidnap him, they slapped him. So remember we talked about the walk to Canossa? This was the slap of, how do you say this, Micah? Anagni. I didn't want to say it wrong. In Italy, that's where the Pope was in his palace, living like a pauper, not living in his wealth and his power and his pomp. And the king sent his ambassage to kidnap, and they slapped the Pope. So it's called the Anagni Slap. You can look that one up. And why did all that happen? Because Pope Boniface VIII, I'm sorry, I only have 7 there. And this slap was in 1303. And by the way, he was kidnapped, and for 3 days he was held, and then he died within a month. So it basically ended his life. The Pope died about a month after the kidnap. That was in 1303. In 1302, before this, that created a lot of this, that exasperated, that brought it to a culmination. He issued a unum sanctum. And this was the unum sanctum, 1302. One sword must be under the other. So what sword is going to be under? In other words, they can't be equal. One has to be under the other. Well, the Pope is writing it, so who's going to be under who? Okay. It said the temporal authority must be subject to the spiritual. Now, remember, the spiritual authority excommunicated the temporal authority. In this case, the Pope excommunicated the king. Therefore, if earthly power strays from the right path, it is to be judged by the spiritual. Now, this is a papal bull. This is where the Pope speaks with absolute authority from God. This is a papal bull. So this is the Pope speaking as God on earth, as the vicar, the substitute of Jesus Christ, okay? He said, if the earthly power strays from the right path, it is to be judged by the spiritual. But if the supreme spiritual authority strays, it can only be judged by God. It can only be judged by God, not by humans. Now, in other words, nobody can judge the church. No man on earth. The church is accountable to who? Nobody except God alone. That's what this papal bull states. We further declare, affirm, and define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that all human creatures be under the Roman pontiff. He's the successor of Constantine, by the way. That's my position. The pontiff, the priest, the Roman high priest, the vicar, the substitute of Christ. So that's what culminated this conflict. That's a very, very amazing statement, that the church was accountable to no one. No one could judge the church. Earthly powers were to be under the authority of the church. But the point is, however, the church could not back up its claims with an army that could actually defeat the armies of these rising nation states, because this is now after the Crusades. But with all of this, this is after actually the 7 sacraments had been established. So we also want to emphasize, during this period of time, the 7 sacraments are becoming more authoritative, if not absolute dogma, church doctrine during this medieval time, toward the end of the medieval age. And that was because of a man named Thomas Aquinas. So look in your book to where Aquinas is referenced here. We're going to talk about him. And that's on page 231 and 232. And Sid, I was going to have you read last week, so here you go. It's going to be some tough reading. But on page 233, can you go to 233? Right beside letter F, results of the scholasticism. And hierarchical is that word there, and you could just do your best pronouncing some of these big words. But if you could read that paragraph right there, realism and moderate realism.
Realism and moderate realism buttress the sacramental and hierarchical system of the Roman Church by emphasis on universal that led to the subordination of the individual to the more fully appropriate group of institutions. Aquinas' emphasis on the sacraments as the channels of grace strengthened the hold of the Roman Catholic Church on the individual, for there could be no salvation apart from the sacraments dispensed by the hierarchy.
Okay, so what did Aquinas say here? Now, Thomas Aquinas was perhaps the most important teacher of the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. He wrote the theology during his life in the 1200s. This is before the papal bull, actually, that we just mentioned. This is in the 1200s, and that papal bull was 1302. Aquinas basically, in the 1200s, wrote the theology that to the present day is the accepted Roman Catholic doctrine to this day. So you might, and I've often wondered this is church history. So I've often wondered, what do these priests learn when they go into seminary? And how come they don't know the Bible very well? Somebody recently left our church to go to the Roman Catholic Church. You know that. The priest told him that he knows the Bible better than a lot of Roman Catholic priests. Do you know why? Because when somebody goes into the priesthood, they don't study the Bible. They study what others have said about the Bible, because that's what the Catholic Church has been doing for 2,000 years. It's kind of like the Jewish people. They study not the Bible, not the Tanakh, but they study the Talmud and all the things that have been, all the tradition that's been piled on top of the Bible. And that's basically what, so, and during this period of time, and we're going to look at this chapter quickly of scholasticism, is Aristotle is now reintroduced into Europe. He's going to be translated. People are going to be studying Aristotle, and they're going to try to balance the philosophy of Aristotle with this scholasticism and age of reason with the Bible, and is faith reasonable? And so basically priests go into the seminary now and they study Aristotle, they study philosophy, they study Thomas Aquinas. And he wrote so much, you could spend your whole life probably reading him and not get all the way through it. Okay, so Aquinas establishes the 7 sacraments. And the seven sacraments, as that quote said, are essential for salvation. If you don't receive these sacraments through the church, then you're not saved. I don't think any of us are saved, according to the Roman Catholic teaching of Thomas Aquinas. So that's just a little bit. The sacraments are, you know what they are, right? Baptism, that's the door to the other sacraments. Baptism is the new birth for the Catholics. And of course, the baptism is not a believer. A baptism is done to an infant. Confirmation encourages that one baptized in their progress. Then, of course, the Eucharist is the crown of the sacraments, the centerpiece of the Roman. So what's the big difference between like a Bible-believing church like us and a Roman Catholic church? The center of the Roman Catholic service is the Eucharist. It's the Mass. The center of our service, based on the Bible, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, and to the Word of God. Preach the Word. So that's the center of our service. So for the Catholics, it's the Eucharist. So then we have a confession, anointing of the sick, which is also extreme unction. That's to get them to the finish line. And then holy orders. That's the ordination of the priests into the ranks, because they have to have somebody, in a sense, accepted to then administer these other ordinances, or what they call sacraments, and then marriage. So those are the seven sacraments. And you might want to write this down about a sacrament. A sacrament is not just a ritual that represents an inner truth or an inner experience of the heart. Like we believe that a believer gets baptized, right? Because they have a true experience in their heart. Now they do something outwardly to represent what happened inside. But that's not what a sacrament is. A sacrament conveys grace. Grace comes to the believer through the sacrament. Now, so up to this time in history, again, I want to emphasize this. This is why we're talking about this. And this is important because the sacraments are at the center of the salvation of the Roman Catholic system. And we need to understand Roman Catholicism. I believe it's helpful for us. But the sacraments were not clear to be seven until this time in history. Until Thomas Aquinas, and even before him, a man named Peter of Lombard. He was a teacher at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, France. By the way, I have a picture of that somewhere along the way, of Notre Dame. So the sacraments contained and confer grace. And I'll just read this and I'll be done. At least when I try to get through some notes in the last few moments. This is what I read from Schaap's history book. He said, for them, God was the great physician. Okay, we believe that. Man is the invalid. Okay, I'm with you. The priest is the messenger. I'm not with him. No, any child of God is a messenger. Grace is the antidote. Okay, we believe that. For by grace we're saved. We believe grace is the antidote. But the sacrament is the vase. And for them, grace is the grace is in the vase. So the vase, the sacrament is the vase. And the grace is inside the vase, but who has control of the vase? The Catholic Church and the priest. So if you're going to get grace, you have to go to the priest and to the church. So this is something completely different. Okay. We just want to finish up what we said about last week. We were talking about the Baptists of the Middle Ages, the Waldensians and the Albigenses, and here the Petrobrusians, led by Peter of Bryce. And we talked about this last week. Real fast. Remember, we talked about this and we said that the Baptists of the Middle Ages, we talked about Peter of Bryce, and he died a martyr's death. And then Arnold of Brescia, he died a martyr's death, and Henry of Lausanne, and they started different groups, Petrobrusians, Albigenses, Henricians, and then when they all died they were all dead by the mid 1100s. Then Peter Waldo came along in 1170, and they all basically became known as Waldensians. That's a generalization, but I think it's a generally true generalization that happened. Did you get that picture there? Okay, so we talked about that last week in our highlight. All right, so here we have the Petrobrusians, led by Peter of Bryce, preaching in southern France in the early 12th century. He was burned as a heretic, 1126. The errors, according to the Roman Catholic Church, were 5. They denied that children should be saved by baptism. They rejected the need for church buildings. They saw that the Church of God did not consist of stones, but of believers gathered in the name of Christ. They did not display crosses for veneration, adoration, or supplication. They denied sacramental grace and the Roman Catholic Mass. They derided prayers for the dead, or that any good deed of the living could aid the dead. I believe any true Bible believer holds to those errors. The Henricians is next. Letter D is Mass. Letter F is the Henricians. You could spell it, I think, either I-A-N-S. I've seen it 2 ways, or just A-N-S. Henricans or Henricians. I've seen it both ways, so I don't know which is the most accurate. But Henry of Lausanne, he renounced the cloistered life, began to denounce the moral lives of the monks that he previously resided with. He adopted most of the doctrines of the Petrobrusians. He was arrested, condemned to imprisonment. The followers left behind were called Henricians and eventually were absorbed into the Waldensians. So the response of the Catholic Church to these teachings that we've talked about, and notice the different groups. If you just go back in your notes, just to say them and review them. The Paulicians, that was letter A. The Bogomils, they were in Bulgaria. The Albigenses, sometimes called Cathari in France. The Waldenses, the Petrobrusians, the Henricians. The Catholic Church had crusades. They developed also, I don't have this in the notes here, but they developed different orders, the Dominicans against them. And then they forbade the Bible to them. The Bible was placed on the index of forbidden books. So they kept the Bible from the people. The Catholic Church did not want people to have the Bible. That's history. And then the Inquisition was started in the middle of the 12th century, around 1184. And I think that's earlier in your notes, but that's the last blank here, number 4, the Inquisition. And that lasted for like 600 years. And I read about the Waldenses, by the way, they because of the persecution against them, and some of the persecution was very vicious, and it was sometimes mass killings, that they went up into the Alps of France, and you could look it up, the Cottian, I don't know if I'm saying it right, Cottian, Cottian Alps. And that's the mountains that border France and Italy. And that's where they grew. And then from there, they expanded out. And so there were true Bible believers during during these dark ages. God has his church, because Jesus said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So the conclusion here on page 30 is the persecutions against these Bible-based groups above was continuous and severe, yet they were not stamped out while sometimes driven underground. And I believe that most of the history written about them is written by their enemies. So they are often misrepresented. and they hid throughout Europe and waited for the daylight of a new day that would come. So as we finish this class, we're going to finish with chapter 23, 24, 25. And chapter 24 especially is going to introduce to us the forerunners of what is called the Reformation in 1517. So we're going to go up to 1517, but we're going to see two of the great strong believers who died for their faith toward the end of the medieval period of time. Actually, maybe three: Wycliffe, John Huss, and Savonarola. So there's hope for the people of God in the midst of the growing papacy with all of its corruption. Okay, so we'll stop right there, and we'll do Lord willing chapter 23 next week. Okay, God bless you. Have a good night.
Good night, Pastor. Good night, everyone.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night,
God bless
everybody.
you.
Take
Good night,
care.
everyone.
Hey, good night,
Thank you,
Raul. How you
Pastor.
doing, Raul? Oh,
Yeah,
Liz,
I'm
talk to us too. Yeah, you doing okay, Raul?
Yeah, thank God, praise God, yeah.
Oh, did Liz just?
I don't know how she and the Shook were doing in Florida.
I think she just punched out. Oh, okay. Anyway, it was nice to see Liz
You
down
move
there
to
in Florida.
you got to sign off before 9 o'clock. What's up with that, you know?
Yeah.
God
Okay,
bless
good night,
you all.
everybody. God bless.
Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night. Thank you, Pastor. Thank you, everyone. Bye.